focus on mothers in preparation for Mother's Day. I read through the story of Jochebed, Moses' mother. I was watching as the widow of Zarephath with her son filled the oils to the brim, one after another, those barrels of oils there with Elijah. And I watched as the Proverbs 31 woman worked and toiled for her family. I even took a look at Jesus' mother and read her story. And then when I got to the story of the mom we're going to look at today, I was taken back, by all that mothers go through and how hard they have it in life. You think about the life of a mother, and you just have to really just take a step back, and you're humbled. From the very beginning of it, from the moment of conception, a mom begins to struggle with the baby in her womb for 9 months. Her skin is stretching, and day after day, more as the baby grows, the pain gets worse and worse and worse. And then there's that constant fear, right, throughout the entire pregnancy of, is the baby okay? Have I been eating right? The vitamins, and the fear of a miscarriage, all the way up to the day of birth, only to have another day of trial because now she has to go through labor and to have that baby. And then finally, the toil is over. You're holding that baby in your arms. And yet that's just the beginning, isn't it? Because then comes the next 20 years of your life where you spend raising that child day after day, struggling, trying to give them good guidance and make sure that they walk a good path. You teach them to read and to write. You help the child learn the right way and the wrong way, and you try your very best to guide them in the ways of the Lord. Only to arrive at the end of the road, 18 to 20 years, and now you're beginning a new struggle, right? Because now a mother who has been so attached to a child has to find ways to let that child go and to trust that boy or girl who is now a son or a daughter, a man or a woman, into the hands of God so that they can make their own way and the cycle can begin again. That's the ideal life of a mother. And yet, isn't it true that even that is exacerbated by the fact that sometimes things don't go as we planned? Sometimes that child does struggle to learn to read and to write. Sometimes their health does fail. Or maybe your child, at one point in their life, they come and begin to struggle with low self-esteem. And the mother is faced with this, how do I deal with this? And the truth is, life just happens. We have our own little prodigal son, Caleb. He just turned 4. And it wasn't too long ago when he thought, it's time. He was ready to move out on his own. He walked out the front door, got on his tricycle, and he was down the road. And there was mom and dad chasing him. Trying to get him back. My children may not be at that phase of their life where I can fully understand that kind of a struggle. But I fear that day could always come because it can happen to any one of us. The proverb says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. And yet Proverbs, they're not promises, right? Sometimes life isn't ideal. Sometimes, though, a soft answer turneth away wrath. When you look at Christ, that doesn't always turn out that way. And sometimes things, they fall apart. But when life takes an unexpected turn, when life doesn't go the way we'd planned, what happens then? Well, if you know anything about mothers, they tend to blame themselves. I have a mom, and she's good at blaming herself for all the mistakes that I've made. And I have a wife, and every time something happens to our kids, it's her fault. Now, if something happens that's positive, and you try to praise her for it, well, that was just the Lord. But if it's bad, it's Amy's fault. And that's just the way mothers are. they feel so responsible, and that weight is so difficult, and they say, if we just read the Bible more, maybe he wouldn't have gone that way, If I had only done more for my babies, maybe things would be different. If I had fed them more vegetables, maybe she wouldn't have gotten sick. And the wheels are turning in mothers' minds. And we dads, we do our best to try to comfort them, to console them, and help them to understand that what's happened and why God has brought something like this into her life. And we find different ways to help them cope with it. You try to help a single mother who's walking out of family court understand God's reasons for that. And you try to explain to a mom who's just lost a baby girl that everything works out for the best. You say God has his motives. Things don't just happen. Amen. Everything works out for the best. God has his reasons. But to say that God has his reasons, while we mean well, what I'm saying is that God is the one that gave my boy cancer. Reasons says that God is why my child walked away from the Lord. Reason claims to know why that toddler absorbed a stray bullet in last week's mall shooting there in Texas. And I know we mean well in this, but as hard as it is to understand and to wrap our minds around some of these things, can I tell you something, Christian? God is not the reason that bad things happen. God is not the reason we live in a fallen world. He's not the reason that the prodigal son leaves home. God's not the reason that Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt. And I read the story. He's not the reason Lazarus died either in the Gospel of John. He was the reason he was raised from the dead, but he wasn't the reason he died. And he's not responsible for the other tragedies of life. The reason bad things happen and the reason there are tragedies in life is because we live in a broken world. But that does not mean that God is not at work behind it all. That does not mean that God does not see our pain in the struggles that we face and that he's not there. Because the Bible tells me that God, he takes those hard times of life, which are completely out of our control, and he reshapes those times according to his purposes, even though we may not see it at first. Friend, that's the difference between reason and purpose. Reason tries to justify every event as good and worthwhile and meaningful and significant. Purpose looks at the bigger picture. Reason is fixated on today, on the present, on how something happened. Purpose looks at why. It looks down the road toward the future. Reason hangs on today. Purpose hangs on God, who is at work in it all. And that distinction, you might say that's a fine line between the two. But I think it's important, especially for the story we're going to look at today. Because at the very beginning of the story, we're going to read about a mother who faces an unthinkable tragedy. And when this happens to her, she does what most of us do in times like these. In her time of heartbreak, she blames herself and she blames God. But later in the story, she comes to realize that God's hand had been at work behind the scenes through all of it, even though she couldn't see it. Our story takes place at one of the darkest periods in Israel's history. If you have your Bibles, you can open up with me to the book of Ruth. We tend to think the story is solely on Ruth, and I appreciate her, but I want to look at the story from a different vantage point today. You know, the book of Samuel is named after Samuel, but I promise you, the story is very much about David. And sometimes the title of a book can be a little deceptive, just because I think sometimes we give Ruth so much focus that we forget where the story began. And we definitely miss where it ends. This was one of the darkest days of Israel's history. It happened at the very same, every single time in this story. The time when the judges were ruling. You get that from the first verse in the book of Ruth. Israel's moral thermometer had registered at an all-time low. Rape, violence, hunger, hate crimes, inflation. I mean, the nation was trapped in an ongoing cycle. In fact, if you ever study the book of Judges, I was going to do my dissertation in Judges. I love this book. More than just a cycle, it really is a downward spiral. Because every time the cycle repeats itself, it gets worse and worse and worse until the very end of the book. And if you're familiar with it, you'll see where it ends. But God's people, this is how the cycle would begin. They would defy God's instruction. God would send invaders to shake up the people a bit. And often, after they repent, they would turn back to the Lord, and the cycle would repeat again. They would defy God's instruction. God would send an army again. And often, accompanied with that rebuke, there would be a famine, an economic mess accompanied by a famine. And it was during one of those famines that our story begins. One family in the city of Bethlehem decides to pull up stakes from their home in Bethlehem and head to the neighboring nation across the Jordan River. Well, they were looking for a better economy, a better home. The man's name was Elimelech. And you can't help but think of the irony in that. Elimelech means, my God is king. You know the word Melchizedek, Melech, king of righteousness. We'll look at him next week. Elimelech means my God is king, and yet my God is king decides to turn his back, uproot his family, and head east across the Jordan River. Elimelech has a family that he takes with him. His wife's name is Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. They have two sons, Malchon and Chilion. Now, understand, for Elimelech to uproot his family and to leave like this, it's like saying to God directly, God, I've got it from here. We'll take over from here. We'll be all right. But then where he goes makes it even worse. Because it says here that he went to Moab at the beginning of Ruth. He took his family in Ruth chapter 1. If I could just get there. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, in verse 1, went to, verse 2, dwell in the country of Moab. God had said, don't go to Moab. Don't deal with these people. Don't marry their daughters. They've done deceivious and disastrous things to my people. Stay away from Moab. But Elimelech wouldn't listen. And he heads off away from God. And going to Moab was almost as if, in your face, right? There he goes, off to a better life. If Elimelech and his family had hoped to find something better in Moab, however, they're sorely mistaken. Because after they get to Moab, things only get worse for Elimelech and his family. Soon after he arrives, Elimelech dies. And things go downhill from here. We hear not too long after that his sons married Moabite daughters. Now, recognize, we said a moment ago, God's people were instructed not to marry Moabites, right? Because God knew that the Moabites would turn their hearts from the Lord. And so in marrying Moabites, they were disobeying God's instruction. And then it goes from bad to worse, because sometime later, Naomi loses her two sons. And now she's all alone. She's lost her husband. Her sons are gone. She has lost everyone who could provide for her, who could give security. And not only this, but in the culture that Naomi was living, this meant, in losing her husband and her sons, that she had lost all of the family fortune, all of the heritage. She was economically destitute now. And to top this all off, she now has 2 widowed daughters-in-law, Moabites at that. And she's living in a foreign country. Naomi was really at probably the worst place anyone could be at in life. I wouldn't be surprised if she went through a spout of depression during this time. I can't imagine how dark things looked from her perspective at that place in her life. Must have been one of the darkest moments. Sometime after these tragedies, Naomi hears that God had been visiting his people in Israel. We read in Ruth 1:6 that she had heard in the country of Moab, at the end of the verse, that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. There's another little interesting nugget there. Bethlehem means house of bread. And there God is giving bread to his people in the house of bread. And so at the beginning of verse 1:6, she arose that she might return from the country of Moab. But Naomi wanted what was best for her daughters-in-law. She had grown close to them, and she knew that this would be a difficult journey, and it would be a foreign land for them. And so she instructs them to go back to their families. You read that they shed some tears, they kiss each other goodbye. And at that point, one daughter-in-law, Orpah, she heads home. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth's name means friendship, she wouldn't budge. And her reply has come down through the ages as a famous one, isn't it? She says in Ruth 1, verse 19, "Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried." And it says here at the end of verse 19 that after that, the two of them, they went together until they came to Bethlehem. It was late one afternoon, early May. Envision with me here. The people of Bethlehem are out there in the fields outside of the city, gathering the harvest now, hauling the sacks of barley into the town. It was just another day at work. Suddenly, a commotion begins to stir right there around the city gates. Everyone is gathering, and as you get closer, you can hear the whole town is buzzing by now. For a familiar face was standing there in the gates. You can hear one of them in verse 19 say, "Is this Naomi?" Your faces are telling me I have the wrong verse. I do. Yeah, the end of verse 19. "Is this Naomi? Naomi has returned." And her response is pretty famous. Naomi responds, "No." Remember, Naomi means pleasant. And she says, "I'm pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. I have no husband. I have no family. Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. "Because Shaddai, the Almighty, has dealt bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home empty. And the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." And as you read Naomi's words, especially the way God has the biblical writer shape this, you can tell we're meant to have compassion on her. I mean, she doesn't understand what's happened, and at this point, neither do we. She can't put it together. She can't see the bigger picture. All she knows is that she's lost her family. I think we would have said the same thing. You know, we can feel Naomi's pain, even if we can't understand. Unless you've been where Naomi is, you can't appreciate what she's going through. But you know she's hurting. You know she's lost what she cherishes most. I understand Naomi's broken. But as you read through her deep wounds and you get a sense of her bitterness, you recognize that pain it leads her to misread a few things, doesn't it? Because as you're reading through this passage, you recognize she didn't really go out full, right? There was a famine in the land. She and her family had left Bethlehem because of a drought. And then we're meant to recognize this. She says she went out full and she's come back empty. But that isn't true either, is it? Because in verse 14, we read a moment ago that Ruth clung to her. In verse 17, listen to Ruth's commitment. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. You know, it's difficult to see what God is doing when we're in our pain. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have thought exactly what Naomi was thinking. I'm not critical of Naomi's perspective here. But in her sorrow, I think she misunderstands. I mean, is verse 21 really true? Has the Lord testified against Naomi? Sometimes our loss can lead us to wrong conclusions about God and what he's doing in our lives. Because I don't think he has. In fact, you're going to see in the very next scene that God is already at work in Naomi's life. We said a moment ago it was the beginning of the barley harvest. At this point, Naomi and Ruth, they had no food, no money. They had no social security checks. I mean, they had nothing. And Ruth was eager to make a way for her mother-in-law. Can you imagine that? I mean, we said a moment ago, this was the days in which the judges were ruling. And in the book of Judges, it said that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And yet here was Naomi's daughter-in-law, a Moabite at that, putting her mother-in-law before herself. Ruth spent the day following harvesters throughout the field. She was gathering what they had dropped on the ground. Now, understand, we read this in Leviticus. In Hebrew culture, that was completely appropriate. Poor people were allowed to do that. They were allowed to pick up the grain along the edges of the field that the reapers would drop behind them. They were not to pick that up. That was for the poor people. That's one way that Hebrew culture would help the poor. Anything that fell on the ground was theirs. Ruth 2:3 says that she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And in whose field do you think she ended up? Out of all the fields in Bethlehem, in whose field do you suppose Ruth landed? Verse 4 says, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. I love how the Hebrew says it. Literally, her chance chanced upon the field of Boaz. What a fantastic coincidence. Why is that important? Well, verse 1 tells us why this is important. Because chapter 2, verse 1 says there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. So Boaz was a relative of Naomi's late husband. What are the odds of that? I mean, what an amazing coincidence, right? Out of all the areas of Bethlehem, Ruth gleans in the field of Boaz. It's as if someone might have planned that. It's as if someone wanted these two to meet. When Boaz realizes who Ruth is, he makes her feel at home. He feeds her. She's told, the servants are told they're to treat her well. And there's a little nugget given that they're instructed to drop extra reaps of grains all throughout the day. Oops. Ruth gleans all day in his field. I wish I could have been a fly on that wall that night when Ruth comes home. I suspect Naomi sat in the dark, as she did most days, all alone, struggling with what she's going through. And then the door opens. And Ruth, she walks in that night. I can just imagine 12 baskets, coming in with bags full of grain. Naomi looking, where did you get all that? As she looks over all the abundance, you can see tears beginning to come into Naomi's eyes. And Ruth begins to tell her the story. I found this wonderful man, Naomi. He's the nicest man. He let me glean in his field all day. Would you know, those reapers were the most irresponsible men. They were dropping things left and right. You're not going to believe it. How do they stay in business? Ruth is telling her the story. Naomi looking at all of the abundance, beginning to choke up at all that God has provided for them. Ruth, what did you say his name was? How do you say it in your Hebrew tongue? Buzz, Booz, Boaz, that's it. Naomi hears the name ringing in her ears. She knew Boaz. Her and Elimelech had probably spent time in his fields years before. Boaz was a relative of hers. Naomi is watching this, and she's starting to wonder, could God's hand be at work? And she can't hold back. We read here, then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. Now, you have to understand, I said this at the beginning of the story, that Naomi had lost her right to her family's property when her husband and her sons died. Okay? That was the way it worked in Jewish culture. But Boaz is a male relative. He was one of Elimelech's kinsmen. And so the wheels just turning faster and faster in Naomi's mind. Under Jewish law, a close relative, a kin, could step in and restore and redeem her family's property and wealth through marriage. And Naomi knew that. And if God were bringing Ruth and Boaz together, if this was God's work, and they were to get married, Boaz could be a kinsman redeemer. Boaz could restore Naomi's family's line, which was dead, and that family line could live again. They could buy out and lease the lease of Elimelech's old land and restore the family's wealth. Looking at the stars that night over Bethlehem, I bet Naomi got a feeling she hadn't got in a long time. As she watched and thought that maybe God had been watching over them all along. She hides all of this in her heart, and she's patient. And she slept well for the first time that night in what probably was forever. The story goes on. Ruth works with Boaz, or in Boaz's field for the rest of the barley harvest. They had food. They had a safe place to work. Near the end of the harvest, Naomi finally makes her move. Well, she tells Ruth, my daughter, I believe that's chapter 3, verse 1. My daughter, should not I try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. This is Naomi's plan to Ruth. Sounds a bit odd for our culture, I understand. But she tells Ruth to go down to the threshing floor. Remember, outside the city gates of Bethlehem, into the fields, in the middle of the field at the threshing floor, where the harvesters would thresh the barley. There, Boaz would be, in the dark. She's to go out there where she would propose to him. That night, Boaz is sleeping. Ruth heads out to the field, and he wakes up, and a woman is lying at his feet. Now, when you read this, remember, there's no street lights, and you're not going to light a match in the middle of the barley field and set the whole thing on fire. You can't see anything unless the moon is over you. It's pitch black. And he wakes up, and so naturally he says in verse 9, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. She takes that wedding ring made of barley, twisted up into the shape of a ring. She gets down on one knee, and Ruth says, take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. Would you imagine that? Ruth down on one knee. Boaz, will you marry me? That's just the way it was done. Man, that would have been nice not to have to invest in all that ring. Honey, you could have done all that. Isn't it ironic how when we're the brokest, we're expected to buy the largest investment of our life? I think I did a pretty good job. Boaz tells her, yes, I will marry you. But there's one problem here. Funny how Boaz knew this already, isn't it? Boaz understands there just so happens to be a closer relative. It's as if Boaz had planned this in advance. He knew that there was somebody who had the right to the property before him, someone who had the right to redeem the land in front of him and Ruth. But Boaz has a plan. And so early the next morning, Boaz, he goes down to the gate and he waits for this relative, which he already knows who it is. He waits for him to go by. Boaz calls him over and the elders, and he explains the situation. Now, at first, the relative, he's eager to redeem the property. Well, of course, I'd love to do that. But then comes the punchline, when Boaz suggests to him that he would have to marry the Moabite. And that was all it took. The relative balks at that, and he takes his sandal off, which is which is appropriate in the culture. He gives it to Boaz, and he says, you redeem her. You redeem the land. I cannot do it. Naomi's plan works, and Boaz and Ruth were married. In chapter 4, verse 13, we read that Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in unto her, and the Lord gave her conception. And she bore a son. And that's the end of Ruth's story. But it's not the end of the book. Because Boaz and Ruth go off the scene now. And we've returned to the end, the same place where we began. Naomi. It's been 2 years now since Naomi had returned to Bethlehem. Those who knew her back then as Mara, they wouldn't recognize her anymore. For as she sits there swaddling this beautiful bundle of joy in her arms, everyone knows this is Naomi's baby. Chapter 4, verse 14. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative. And may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you as a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, see, she hadn't come back empty, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also, the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. You know, it's incredible, isn't it? How God took all these different threads, even the dark ones, and he wove them into Naomi's beautiful story. But Naomi couldn't see it that way. And neither can we in our life. We never do. All we can do is wake up every day and we try to put one foot in front of another without stumbling. We try to be faithful with what God's given us and what he's called us to be at the moment. And sometimes when the road gets rough and times get hard, it's in those times that we can easily jump to wrong conclusions about God. And we wonder if God is even involved at all. But you know, while we may not understand at the time, and while we may not be able to see it, God is still involved, and he's still at work. And even though Naomi won't live to see all that God is doing through her life, we read in chapter 4, verse 18 through 21, that Obed would have a son named Jesse. And Jesse had a son named David, who would grow up to be the greatest king in Jewish history. And through David's line, one day would come Jesus, the greatest king of all. And through Naomi's story, we're reminded that God is always there behind the scenes. He's always at work for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose, even though we can't always see it. And he's working all our struggles together for his good, according to his purpose.